Dr. Robert Kokenyesi is a translator and a researcher of Unitarian history. He is the operator of the Unitarian Torch website, where he has worked to raise awareness of the history of the Transylvanian Unitarian tradition, and he has worked diligently as a translator at the Unitarian Churches of First Parish in Bedford, Massachusetts, and Elliott Chapel in Kirkwood, Missouri. His publications have recently included a translation of late 16th century sermons from early Transylvanian Unitarian leadership. Dr. Kokenyesi has a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Miami, and he attends the First Unitarian Church in Alton, Illinois. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Kokenyesi.
When I put together this title, I didn't know about Sean Finnegan's presentation about the Armenian Unitarian community, and I think he would agree with me that it is quite frustrating knowing that there is some kind of a light in this document, in this writing, the thoughts, the ideas presented there, but it's locked away because of a very, very different language from the English. So this is surely the case for Hungarian language materials. So what I would like to do is to present snippets of information from sermons that I've translated and give you just an overview of what has been produced by Transylvanian Unitarians, and if I can be of any help later on, whether building connections with the church folks over there, or if you want to carry out any research activity in this area, I'll be happy to help you out with translating what you are interested in. So I just want to start with a brief diagram of this church, the Transylvanian Unitarian Church. So officially, Transylvanian Unitarian Church became one of the four acknowledged and royally accepted religions in Transylvania in 1568. The Diet of Torda did this. Now, this was not the first well-organized church in Central Europe. The Polish Brethren did that a few years before. And in 1565, the Diet of Brezhny acknowledged their presence and gave permission to operate. The Polish Brethren came to an unfortunate end after their expulsion from Poland. Forced conversions, all kinds of punishments were designed to silence the Rakovian Unitarians, which were mostly in the Socinian version of anti-Trinitarians. So Transylvanian Unitarians continued surviving tremendous hardship, from beheadings to book burnings to church confiscations, property confiscations. Yet today there is an actively working Unitarian church there. Very brief and 16th century geography lesson here. So Transylvania today is part of the country we call Romania. And at this time, Transylvania was part of Hungary. In green, you see the Turkish Empire cutting the country of Hungary in half. So this eastern half became independent under the Principality of Transylvania title. And to show a little more bird's eye view, more familiar countries, Great Britain, France, Germany, and here's the old Hungarian kingdom, largely occupied by the Turkish forces. And here, this little part is Transylvania. A few words about the contemporary Hungarian Unitarian Church. About 10 years ago, the country of Hungary and country of Romania unified their Hungarian-speaking Unitarian churches. The church was before called Transylvanian Unitarian Church. Today, when you go to their website, it's Hungarian Unitarian Church. It's recognized by the state, so they operate officially. They have an elected bishop in Cluj, in Hungarian name Kolozsvár. There's a total of 136 churches divided into separate districts. In the center is the headquarters. This is where the bishop's office is. There is a Unitarian high school in the very same building. About 20 feet to the left, you see this late 19th century Unitarian Church, built as Unitarian and maintained as Unitarian. This is called the Kolozsvár Downtown Unitarian Church. The other side, you see the statue of Dávid Ferenc, who was the founder of this Unitarian religion in Transylvania. I just translated a sermon number 35 on my UnitarianTorch.com website. This sermon is about describing how incredibly arduous process was to make a statue erected and unveiled for Dávid Ferenc in Kolozsvár. So even today, there are hardships, administrative hardships mostly from the state, but the church is alive, doing it well as it could. I translate sermons because I believe it gives the best personal insight into the minds of a spectrum of individuals. Not everybody thinks alike. And I think that's where one receives the most benefit of understanding who these people are, what they think, how they prepare a sermon, what's in there, what structures they use. And so this is the reason why I translate sermons. I wanted to say a few words about the process of translation. I want to create or start to establish a level of trust. I put a lot of effort into these sermons. There are several steps. I pay a native English speaker. Karen Burton has a Master of Divinity degree, so she understands religious language. Her contribution is to review, edit, make suggestions on these sermon translations. So a lot of the Hungarian syntax that I still have in there. So another level of trust, how do you know that I actually speak Hungarian? So I was born and raised in Hungary, spent 24 years of my life before emigrating to the United States. I have family relationships there, so I have to speak Hungarian with them. I maintain, I think, a good fluency. Whenever I visit Hungary, I do okay. With my English, you all can hear an accent. Nonetheless, I think I can express myself okay. When I translate, I use several online dictionaries to help me out, so I put all the effort I can into translation. Could they be better? I'm sure they could be. If you think about Bible translations, why are there so many ways to translate the Bible? Very few people agree just what is the best translation. All I can say is giving you the best I can with these translations. I divided this 454-year timeline into periods just for easier understanding. So the first is establishing identity, founding the church, and early defense of anti-Trinitarian faith articles. So the honeymoon period of Transylvanian Unitarians lasted for 3 years. While Dávid Ferenc first expressed anti-Trinitarian views and argued for them in 1566, the church was founded in 1568. By 1571, the king, who was Unitarian or turned Unitarian, died, and Catholic rulers took over Transylvania. That was the end of the honeymoon period, and slowly the privileges and the status of the Transylvanian Unitarian Church started to erode. And this is where the early defense comes in. Dávid Ferenc was in prison because he espoused the view publicly, very publicly, that Jesus should not be prayed to. This part of the Unitarian movement called the non-adorationist movement. He was in prison and died in prison in 1579. I don't want to read out all the material that's there. I put it on these slides, what's available and what has been translated. Only partial translation of most of his works are available in English. I don't believe personally reading summaries. This is why I try to emphasize translating source materials. But with Dávid Ferenc, a lot of this is either in Latin or in old-style Hungarian. Transcribing his sermons into modern Hungarian is in process in Budapest, Hungary. I can hardly wait. After this came an era of more heavy persecution. Enyedi György was the third bishop of the Transylvanian Unitarian Church. He started in the mid-1580s and he died in 1597. He was the main and most powerful figure to try to maintain stability. Catholic institutions approached Unitarian faithful and asked them all kinds of inconvenient questions. Unitarian individuals were forced out of government positions. So the status of Unitarian religious institutes on the decline. So Enya de George was a bishop who tried to maintain the stability, keep the spirits of the Unitarian Transylvanians. In 1636, long after Enya de George died, there was a forced, at least on paper, a forced change in the Transylvanian Unitarian doctrine. The leadership signed a document that stated that now they are adoring Christ in addition to God. What I'm reading is that most churches, especially small villages, this was not followed. Nonetheless, this is why 1636 is the end of this era when persecution is done with after signing of the document. So let's take a look at what Enya de George did. Concio, Latin for sermon, and there are a number of these concios that I want to say a few words about. There are 213 of these. I translated only a few. Two of them were published in a Unitarian Universalist religious journal. This is Concio 94 or Sermon 94. Why is it beneficial to be fearful of God? So this is Enya de George's explanation to an average churchgoer. When you read the Bible quote, and every sermon starts with a Bible quote in Transylvanian Unitarian churches, why is this word fearful appears in this quote? So he is explaining is that there are different types of fears, and his major conclusion is that being fearful of God is more like being fearful of somebody who's been extremely good to you, who's been your benefactor, being concerned. And in this sermon, the little flock is not to be feared. And maybe I should phrase it more in English way. So it's not to be feared that we Transylvanian Unitarians form a little flock. The number of true believers was always in a minority. Just because the Catholic Church states that we are the universal church, Catholical, Transylvanian Unitarians should not fear that, should not be intimidated by that. And this is just a sign that when you walk down on the street in Kolozsvár, Catholic folks may join you, ask you questions, or talk to you. A lot of the times, conversations must have turned this way because this sermon was preached in a huge Unitarian church. So this must have been a common concern. Enya de George probably heard this from churchgoers, what's happening in their life, how to answer these. So when you read this, why do Catholics brag about their denomination? So this just tells you the ongoing contest for believers between the Unitarian and the Catholic denomination. Late 1500s, most people do agricultural work. There's no internet. People come to their pastor, ask very, very simple questions. This is a reflection how the sermon is written. Churchgoers may say, somewhat reasonably, that Christ has been gone a long time. Where do we find his words? How can we comply with the calling of the apostle? There is a step-by-step derivation. How can we trust that what we read in the Bible is the word of Christ? Just an example of responding to churchgoers' concern. And the next one is yet another common concern. Apparently, some churchgoers were reluctant to sing hymns, participate in this activity. And so he explains why is this a beneficial Christian practice, how you should go about doing this, why you should be enthusiastic about this. There are sermons where he describes that I know that you are more interested about how your livestock is doing or whether your barn needs cleaning, but at church, participate and be there. This was a common concern of his, making sure that the churchgoers receive advice on this. With sermon number 192, there's a series of sermons, 192, 193, 194, uses the second psalm. This in Central Europe was a central area of Trinitarian versus anti-Trinitarian argument. As he describes, first building an argument that Christ was the Son of Man, born at a given time. One of the main logic is that if Christ is not eternal, that he must have been born at a particular time, must have started his existence at a particular time. If he is not eternal, he cannot be co-equal to God. What you see here are small snippets from an 8-page long sermon. I hope this is more of an appetizer than encouragement to read the entire sermon. Again, arguments that the word anointed is used in many places in the Bible, so it is not a sign that Christ has a special status co-equal to God. Sermon 193 continues the psalm, and the arguments continue again. So written literally and historically about David, but spiritually about Christ. An interesting aspect here that I included here is the actual polemics, debate, conversation with Catholics. Now, these debates were carried out person-to-person debates. Sometimes the king presided over it. Sometimes this was done in printed material. This is a great summary. So to begin with, no Christian could deny this is a Unitarian position, and how we disagree with and cannot compromise with Papists and Trinitarians. And it goes on that they state that this passage must be interpreted as an evidence that the Son was naturally born to God, proving that he is eternal. When we refute that by saying that the entire house of Israel, kings and others have been called sons of God, this is the antithesis. And then it goes on all the way until the last argument the Catholics place. Among other, they bring up the words of David in Psalm 2:7, "Thou art my son." The Unitarian response to that is that David will never prove, meaning the Papists, the eternal birth from the Bible. This is the logic of argument. I just wanted to illustrate it here. A relationship that came up in one of the talks is Christ lesser than God. This is adding to building up this anti-Trinitarian argument. And the last argument here in this sermon, that even though you heard all this evidence from me and the Judge, and if you're not convinced about this truth, take a look at Catholic scholars who state the same thing. And he gives a reference here in the middle of the sermon. Catholic scholars who came to a similar conclusion about this. Here's the last part of the second psalm related sermon. Relationship to rulers, what should we expect of them? Kind of a veiled criticism of the Catholic rulers at the time. While they are given worldly power, there is a higher authority that they also should be held to a higher standard. So this is the expression of, I think, some of his disappointment how things were going in the country, especially in reference to the suppression of Transylvanian Unitarians. And I think this is the last part of that argument. After 1636, there is an even more forceful oppression of the anti-Trinitarian religion in Transylvania. Instead of local Catholic rulers, now there's the Austrian Habsburg Empire who is providing the muscle behind this oppression. Habsburg Empire came to occupy and own Hungarian territory because the army of the Habsburg Empire fought the Turkish troops and they suppressed the Ottoman Empire way south to the current borders of Hungary. There came yet another wave of Catholic-related suppression. So the end of this era is 1861. This is when the Habsburg Emperor declared that we need to acknowledge and support other religions besides the Catholic religion in the empire. So 1861 is a time of relaxation of this oppression and opening of the church activities. The person who's going to take center stage here, Szent Abrahami Lombard Mihály, was a bishop of the Transylvanian Unitarian Church. Most of his sermons have disappeared. The only sermon he has is a very long funeral sermon. I represented it here because that's on the website. He was the one who wrote a 400-page collection of the Transylvanian Unitarian faith articles. It is still used today It was written in late 1630s, maybe 1640s. It was not printed until the 1800s because the Habsburg Emperor would not give permission to the printing of this material. Again, just a sermon included here. The uniqueness of this sermon is that there's no Bible quote. The title is Origin and Attributes of Justice. This sermon starts with a great deal of lamentation and expression of pain, not only because the person who passed away was a Transylvanian Unitarian judge who worked in the royal court. This was the only Unitarian who made it that far. So with his loss, Unitarians lose influence yet again, which was a very sad situation. We can see through his introduction how natural disasters struck Transylvania, and he complains that there was no good vine in Transylvania that year. Another year, scorching heat burned the crops. He also lists a number of Unitarians who died, either as a consequence of the plague, which hit Transylvania at that time, or from natural causes. And then he says that I have digressed from my topic. Picture yourself middle of January in Transylvania. You're looking at a cascade. You might be standing in inches of snow. And after an hour, he's saying, I'm sorry, I digress from my topic. Let's get on with this funeral sermon. In those days, in the 1700s, for a high-ranking official like this judge, there had to be 6 funeral sermons preached. One had to be in Latin. So this was the one in Latin. So if you put together the Latin language for hours in somewhat adverse circumstances, it's amazing that people listen. So he believes that he prepared such an attractive topic to continue that they will stay with him. He picks a Greek mythological event. I'm not great in Greek mythology. You might recognize this quote. This is when justice departed from earth and went to the skies. And so his promise is that for the time of this sermon, he will attempt to bring justice back. And that to me says I was another thing that everybody was craving in those days, justice, especially when you talk about Transylvanian Unitarian communities. He goes on listing what justice is. This person who deceased was a judge. And so this is a really good connection, at least in Lombard Mihai's mind. He goes to pages and pages of ancient Greek and Roman references to how justice should be and should not be provided. This is the comment on the judge's activity. In this high position, he could act as a protector of the homeland, which was Transylvania. When somebody approached him with something inappropriate, he would just say that the laws of our homeland does not allow this. Our next era, this is the era of official enlightenment. Ideas are allowed to be discussed. The Habsburg Emperor provided a nominal financial support to the Transylvanian Unitarian Church, and this is what we can call a beginning of tolerance. Although the church property that was confiscated was not returned, school buildings that were confiscated were not returned. There was a lot of grievances still, but at least they could breathe a sigh of relief, build at least a few churches. So this is a very active era in the life of the Transylvanian Unitarian Church. The closing date is 1941. This is when the area of Transylvania is finally attached to the current country, Romania. So this is when the Transylvanian Unitarians are not just a minority population by religion, but they are a minority by nationality as well. And that's a game changer. So here I have another bishop who also had the hobby of collecting folk tales. He has a 300-page printed collection of Transylvanian folk tales, very much in love with his homeland. This is about the divine truth. That's titled The Divine Truth. There's an interesting comparison yet again with Catholic belief system. Within the sermon, again, there's quite a few more pages to this, comparing the divine truth with the Catholic canonical doctrine, compares Christ of the divine truth, which the Unitarian belief system, to the canonical doctrine. What you see here expressed is that Christ was not co-equal to God. Christ was a son, but lesser than God himself. Compares the Bible, canonical doctrine, and when he says here that we struggle to understand contradictions, I think that speaks to believers today too. Think about the concept of Trinity. I think that is befitting to that explanation. Conclusion from a Unitarian side is the limitless and unending love of our fellow human beings to establish God's kingdom on earth. In 1868, this was the first time Transylvanian Unitarians were allowed to celebrate an anniversary. Before that, did not receive permission from higher authorities. So there was an incredible jubilation waiting for 300 years for this to happen. And so Ferenc József, he was the bishop longest in office. He was a bishop for 52 years. A lot of changes happened under his bishopric. This is the celebratory sermon. There were representatives from many countries in Europe, England as well. And so he was very, very happy to see all those visitors. The title is Freedom of Faith, of Conscience. And during the introductory part of the sermon, so stand fast before wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with yoke of bondage. So the force or the appearance of traditions instead of biblical material, that's what Ferenc József believes this warning was about, and concludes that that admonishment was not successful because after the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there came additional elements introduced into Christianity. And he describes a number of those. Those introduced elements had a degrading effect on faith and conscience. And so Christians were no longer allowed to select the faith. And so here is the opposing reaction to all those. Every action creates an opposing reaction. A number of elements that contributed to this opposing reaction. And from Arianus, Wycliffe, Waldensian, whose sides these were the first opposing reaction. And he has a statement here. Again, this sermon is about 13 or 14 pages long, so you see tiny snippets. Please read about this. But he does say that God forbid that I diminish the achievement of the Reformation. However, history recorded that even the most famous reformers lowered their standards when it came to freedom of faith of consciousness. In the sermon, he goes on and lays out a plan for the Transylvanian Unitarian Church now that freedom has arrived. And here comes another era of oppression. This is by the communist authorities. So Romania, just like many countries in Eastern Europe, was turning into a communist state aligned with the ideology of the Soviet Union. Religious practices weren't exactly encouraged. There was a time period of adjustment in the Transylvanian Unitarian Church to becoming a minor nationality. And then came the revolution in 1956 in Hungary. The Romanian authorities feared this so much that they trumped up charges against many Unitarians who were hardcore nationalists in their beliefs. A handwritten book of sermons was confiscated, and whoever had written in that book were arrested and eventually sent to labor camp. So 1958 was a year where many Unitarian ministers, office holders were tried and very quickly sent to labor camps. I have a special affinity with this. This was a kind of injustice that did not come from a religious authority. This is a worldly authority. To me, personally, it's very upsetting to see something like this happen. There's a reason why I left Hungary during the communist era and emigrated to this country. And Szabó Dezső, who was a minister in a small village, was one of the persons who wrote in this book. So he was arrested and sent to labor camp. What I'm showing here are 2 sermons from a male and a female minister. Both of them were written 5-10 years after their release. What in my mind, meekness means power under control is solving trouble about expressed here. Because they could have written just derogatory terms about the regime, which would be totally true, emotionally acceptable, but they chose not to do that. These sermons were published by the Transylvanian Unitarian Church. He doesn't say that communist dictators are good-for-nothing people. He would have been right about it, but the demeanor topic that he chose, to me, an astonishing self-control, must have come from a deep believing church. Spending 6-7 years in a labor camp in Romania is not a vacation time. So Nita Roberto, she was a wife of a minister in a co-ministering status in a small village. And when I say small village, imagine a village with 500-600 inhabitants, and everybody lives off the land. So very, very simple folks, and those who minister to them were simple folks too. Berta titled her sermon after an experience that she had in church, looking at hymnals that had a golden chalice or golden cup painted on them. And the children complained that the chalice was worn off of their book. They wanted to get a shiny new looking one. So she started asking questions. So where is the value in this church? The essence is the church. Galadimir is a little different story. His daughter managed to escape Romania, eventually immigrated to the United States, and she translated many of his works. He has a 400-page dissertation about the history of sermons in Transylvania. So because of his daughter's work, he is a lot more prominently present in sermonic literature. After his release from labor camp, he was continually hounded by the communist authorities. Eventually, his wife was forced to divorce him, and in 1980, he committed suicide. So Transylvanian Unitarians consider him a martyr of the Unitarian cause. In The Hidden Treasures, he gives an anecdote from his childhood where his mom hid candy from the kids in the house. They were allowed to have that candy only if they did something good. He's using that starting metaphor to the treasure in Christian faith. He comes to the conclusion that this treasure, we are expected to work for it, to find it. And once we find this treasure is more like a seed. We may not recognize it immediately as a treasure. It will grow on us, a tree with fruit. God doesn't serve the kingdom of God on a silver platter, just expression that we're expected to search. And this is the final period. So the most important aspect here is that this is a living, continuing church. I decided to translate several sermons from younger ministers. The Holy Spirit is a topic not approached very frequently by Transylvanian Unitarians because of the fear that it will create a sizable backlash from both Calvinist and Catholic circles. But on the occasion of Pentecost, this is a traditionally structured and traditionally worded service topic, the arrival of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. This is the current bishop, Kovács István. He was elected in 2020, but because of coronavirus restrictions, he could not be inaugurated. So this is his inauguration sermon. As you see, all the sermons begin with one, sometimes two or more Bible quotes. And this is very traditional. What you see here at the beginning is the opening prayer. You see he's praying to God. His knees are trembling and questions are swirling inside of him. He was a minister to a medium-sized Unitarian church deep in Transylvania. Romanian influences started to filter in more and more. His personal ambition to make service the major goal for, at least for his tenure, or emphasize this. This is still part of the prayer, answering the call. This is now the more contemporary ministers. When you see the word Monarch Scholar, the Unitarian Universalist Association have started a partner church program with Transylvanian Unitarian churches. Despite the difference between religious beliefs, several American churches have successfully partnered with Transylvanian Unitarian churches. The Transylvanian Unitarians look at this as fulfilling the second commandment of Jesus, love thy neighbor as thyself. What's missing in this connection is the fulfillment of the first of Jesus' commandment from the American side, because in a Unitarian Universal Association church, you rarely, if ever, see the consequence or the expression of love by God with all your might, all your soul. Nonetheless, the Monarch Scholarship attracts young Transylvanian ministers to the United States. They learn the language a little bit better. They learn organizational skills. Almost all of them mentioned this upon their return, that spiritually something was lacking here. Jakub Halzi is the first one, and he is using the story of Good Samaritan, and she is explaining this with the, I guess, metaphor that the opposite to love is not hate, but it's indifference. And so this is why she titled her sermon, Do Not Be Indifferent. Here's another Monarch Scholar recipient, Pop Maria. She is, the last time I checked, is a minister in Manchester, England. So these scholarships help bring the biblical Unitarian view to other countries in Europe, and England has been probably most receptive for that. The Empty Hand sermon is discussing how we can come in front of God. We don't have to have an object in our hand. We don't have to have a sacrifice, a gift in our hand. And I want to include two sermons here from current educators. So there is a Protestant Theological Institute in Kolozsvár, Cluj-Napoca. And in addition to Protestant ministers, Unitarian ministers are educated there as well. There is a 4 and a 6 year program. I don't believe there's a master's level of education, but this is an ongoing effort to bring more ministers to the Unitarian Church. Dr. Rezi Elek was a professor of theology there until a few years ago. He wrote this on an anniversary. He was writing this just a few years after the fall of the communist dictator, this jubilation. We can express ourselves yet again. Joy of religious freedom is expressing the joy that they can freely practice. And my last sermon here is from Kovács Sándor. He is the current professor of theology at this Protestant Theological Institute. He is also the church historian. If you have any desire to ask questions, talk to anybody there, he's a great contact. He speaks English very well, and he knows everything about the church. He just wrote a book a year ago, 150, 200 pages, about the brief history of the Transylvanian Unitarian Church. Very knowledgeable individual. He wrote this sermon inspired by, as a consequence of a car trip in Transylvania. On the way there is, I'm using a metaphor, on the way to a destination on a car trip. Here he was on the way between Torda and Kolozsvár. It's about a 50-mile distance. Torda is a town where the religious tolerance edict and the acceptance of the Transylvanian Unitarian Church was carried out in 1568. Today it's a Catholic church. This is one of the churches that have been confiscated and never returned. Nonetheless, there is a monument for religious freedom that the Unitarians erected next to that church. He's excited to see what happened in Torda. But then he says how unfortunate we are being a religious minority, what we had to endure so far. One false idol, especially for ministers, is the visible part of the church. And again, he is emphasizing that it's a sign of God's providence, that he rather considers our deeds than the number of church buildings. To me, it goes towards the explanation of do not fear, little flock. I'm going to close right here. Thank you for your patience. And if you have any questions, I hope you pass something on. But if you want to make contact, please look me up through my email. And especially if you want to read the entire set of sermons or entire sermon, please visit the website. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Kokenyesi. First, how much has the Hungarian language changed since David Ferenc's day to today?
Yeah, so Hungarian language changed quite a bit. For Enyedi György's sermons, it was incredibly helpful that the sermons were transcribed into modern Hungarian. Otherwise, translation would have taken 2-3 times longer. So I don't know enough English to compare Shakespeare's English to today's English. I understand that I read the original Shakespeare text. It doesn't fit well with me, so there's at least that much difference between today's English and the
Perfect.
older English. I'm sorry, older Hungarian.
Did the Transylvanian Unitarians ever figure out how to convince many of their Catholic countrymen to reform their views and become Unitarian?
So there's a story about this that when the Turkish Empire occupied Hungarian territory, by the virtue of their presence, the influence of Catholic Church lessened. And when Catholic believers felt a little bit liberated, they flocked to the Unitarian beliefs. After, in 1568, David Ferenc returns from Torda with the good news of the act of religious freedom, that Unitarians are now accepted as the official religion of the country. He gave a speech from a big boulder at the side of the wall of the town, and legend has it that 3,000 people converted to Unitarianism. So I don't know how many of them were Catholics, but there was some influence there.
Well, if you ever find that magical boulder,
Yes, actually.
please bring it to the United States.
Or to you.
We'd love to use it.
I can send you a picture.
Did the Transylvanian Unitarian Church ever have any contact or communication with English-speaking Unitarians in the 17 or 1800s?
I don't know about the 1700s. In the 1800s, there were two wealthy Transylvanians. One of them was a Unitarian who traveled to the United States, and I think they passed through England. They made contacts at both places, both continents. The influence seems to be one-sided. William Ellery Channing's works from the early 1800s have been completely translated to Hungarian, but there have never been a reciprocation until this website. There have been a single sermon translated and no full text of theological work. So there was contact, spotty, and the interaction tends to be one directional.
Do you have an estimate for how many Transylvanian Unitarian churches are in existence today?
Right, so the church is 126 in Transylvania, and a total membership between 30 and 50,000 people.
And to what extent are today's Unitarian churches in these areas like America's UU groups?
So I'm not going to talk about the architecture, but what happens during a service, maybe if that's the question.
Theologically is
about?
probably the interest.
So the UUA, I don't think they have a theology. UUA, Unitarian Universal Association, have 7 principles. And I think the basic idea is that let's immerse ourselves into all religious experiences, all wisdoms of this planet, and let's gain from that. You do not find that in Transylvania. Transylvania Unitarian was strictly biblical Unitarian.
Are there any Transylvanian Unitarian churches in the United States that may have been founded by Hungarian or Romanian immigrants?
I'm not aware of any of them.
Do the anti-Trinitarian arguments made by the Transylvanian Unitarians differ from those of the Polish Brethren? Or how does their theology relate?
Right. So I just came across a couple of publications from mid-1800s that is titled "We Unitarians Are Not Socinians." The Polish Brethren were considered Socinians, at least in the language of the mid-1800s. And there's a Rakovian catechism from Polish Brethren that doesn't fit quite well with the Transylvanian Unitarian beliefs.
Do they claim apostolic succession in their line of bishops back to the apostles? So do they reject that idea? Perhaps, how does one become a bishop in the Unitarian Church?
So in the 1500s, when this all started out, there was a acknowledgement of caretaker status of a person. And when there was a synod, the synod could call a bishop. So this is an elected position, and they don't claim any continuity to the apostle.
Thank you. And a last question. Pursuant to your comment that they are biblically based, I think that may have been your language. Does the modern Transylvanian Church believe that the Bible is inspired or authoritative? How do they view the scriptures?
So they view the scriptures as containing Word of God. So this is Word of God or inspired by God. When you look inside Transylvania, there is a spectrum of views among ministers, and some of them are more liberal, and some of them are more biblical view. If you want to take a closer look, there is, and if you send me an email, I can send you a link. There's an English language catechism, and that's probably puts it in place because I don't remember all the aspects of it. So they do use and consider the Bible as Word of God or inspired Word of God. But again, there are individual beliefs who may stray from that.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Kokenyesi.
Thank you again for your